Welcome everyone. We're going to give it a minute or two and then we'll get started. If you hear any weird noises behind me, it's a snoring dog. I apologise profusely, but he can snore for Australia. Just welcoming.
Yep.
We're ready to go, Bev?
Yep, let's go. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. Unfortunately, Renee Bowker, our chairperson for the board, couldn't host today because she's joining us very briefly via some airport Wi-Fi. So she's here watching us for the first 10 minutes or so, but other than that, I'm stepping into chair today. I would also add I've got a bit of a heavy head cold, so if those of you who know me might recognise I have a new husky voice going on, so hopefully my voice will last for the seminar. Look, before we begin, I'd really like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm joining you today, which is the Wurundjeri people. And recognise them as the traditional owners of this land. And I pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. We at the Foundation honour the deep wisdom of the world's oldest continuous culture. It still amazes me, and their care for country for thousands of years. I would note that next week, I think it is, starts the 50th NAIDOC week for Australia, which is a huge milestone. So I'm looking forward to celebrating that. Now on to today's session. We're here to explore the new Telco Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence Standard. And the goal of our session today is really to make sure that everyone impacted by the standard walks away with a shared understanding of what's changing, why it matters, and how really the big why is how we can all support victim survivors with specialised care and aligned best practice throughout the industry. At the Foundation, we've had a really long-standing interest in DFV, domestic and family violence. We shorten it to DFV. So for many years, we've been working alongside industry to help improve how telcos support people impacted by DFV. It's something we're really deeply committed to, and we're pleased to see so many of our members on the call here today, but also other members of the industry that we haven't had much to do with before. If you haven't worked with us before, we are the industry's charitable foundation for driving collective action on social issues that are particularly impacted by the increased use and provision of technology. So we have a technology and a charitable focus on social issues that are important to Australians. It could be the misuse of communication to cause harm. It could be the risk of modern slavery and telco, supply chains, any of those sorts of issues. We bring the industry together to talk about and deal with and identify opportunities for a better social outcome. And on the issue of DFE, the Foundation's been working in this arena for about 5 years or more than 5 years. And for me, it's interesting. I've come a full circle because I remember being in a meeting room about 5 years ago with many of the telco reps, just starting to talk about what sort of action we could take to help tackle DFE, both for our customers and for our staff. And I don't think there would be anybody in this webinar today who has not in some way been touched by DFE. And I'll let the experts kind of go into what DFE really means, but it's much more prevalent in our society than often people realise. One of our most significant initiatives that stemmed from that very first meeting has been the development of a DFE action plan, which many telcos on the call today are actively following. These plans we drew together guidance that existed at the time from organisations like Comms Alliance, the TIO, ACMA and others, and in close consultation with the frontline agencies who are actually dealing with this on the ground, we developed this action framework, which is a practical pathway to help telcos understand how they can make a meaningful difference. You know, it's not just words, it's what they can actually do, and that those actions can align with their size and their maturity and their organisational priorities, because this is not a one-size-fits-all. Now, with the introduction of the standard, the action plans are now being updated. So we've got some work going on in the background. It's not complete yet, but we'll incorporate all of the required policies, practices and procedures at the base level of our framework, which is the ADAPT action plan. The embed, the tailor and the influence action plans, which are higher levels that telcos can choose to follow, they will continue to provide a roadmap towards best practice in supporting victim survivors of DFE. So you can expect to see the ADAPT action plan fully aligned with the standard, so that if you're meeting that action plan, you are meeting the requirements of the standard. We wholeheartedly welcome the the new standard. We support the need for specialised care and a consistent approach to how telcos respond to domestic, family and sexual violence. Really important across the industry. But at the same time, we also recognise many of you are smaller telcos. I've been there myself and know what that feels like. And that you might be just at the beginning of your journey, you might be partway along it, to understand this issue in a telco context and work out how to respond. So that's the purpose of today, is to address that challenge that we wanted today to bring to life for those of you responsible for implementing these changes within your organisation, what DFE actually is, why it's really important to do this stuff, not just because there's a standard, because there's real people on the end of it who will be impacted. And we're fortunate. Oh, sorry, I forgot to address this slide here. This is a timeline of the framework that of the work that we've done towards the framework. Many of you have already been through some of this, but some of you haven't. And if you want to know more, you're more than welcome to talk to us about it after the seminar today. So, on to the people who can tell us really what DFE is all about. I would say, for me personally, I heard Karen Bentley speak 5 years ago in a room about a particular scenario involving domestic and family violence and the Build-A-Bear workshops. And Karen, that story has never left me. So these are the people who can tell us what it really means on a human level. So really fortunate to be joined by Karen and Catherine Plunkett, both from WESNet, which is the nation's peak body for agencies dealing with DFE victim survivors, as well as being on the forefront of issues such as tech abuse, which is another topic very close to our heart. They'll both speak on the scale of the problem and its relevance to our industry. We're also really delighted to welcome Samantha York, the Consumer Lead at the Australian Communications and Media Authority, who will take us through the development of the standard and the key thinking that went in behind it and the considerations to developing it. And we're also really lucky to have an industry panel towards the end of the session today, which will feature Peppy Wilson from Comms Alliance and Annie Lay from TPG Telecom, who will be reflecting on the role of the industry in shaping the standard, because there's a lot of work that has gone into this, and share insights on implementation from their respective perspectives. That's terrible. Sorry. If you have any questions, I am a big fan of dropping a question in when it occurs to you. Although we won't be interrupting our speakers, you are more than welcome to pop your questions into the chat. The questions are going to be moderated later in this segment. So if you have a question for ACMA specifically, because they're in the hot seat for the standard, please feel free to include those as well, and we'll collate them and circulate responses to everyone after this session. If we can answer a question towards the end of the session, we will, and if we can't, we'll be circulating afterwards. So, without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Karen, the CEO of WesNet. Karen is also the co-founder of Safety Net Australia project, which examines the intersection of technology and violence against women. From 2017 to 21, Karen was the contact manager for the National Women's Alliance, Australian Women and the Australian Women Against Violence Alliance. She's joined by Catherine, who's the director of Safety Net Australia. She's a subject matter specialist and a leader in gender equity and family violence sectors. She works with survivors, community and organisations using intersectional feminist, human rights and anti-oppressive frameworks to work for social justice and change. Thank you, Karen and Catherine.
Thanks so much, Janet, and it's lovely to be here with my colleague, Catherine Plunkett. I'm just going to try and get some slides shared here. Just the technology, whenever you're talking about technology, often does like to look up. Okay. Right. Okay, can everybody see those slides? Hopefully, I can't see anybody now. So yes, but Catherine's nodding there for me, which is great. So today we wanted to talk to you a little bit about domestic and family violence and other forms of violence. We want to do that, we hope, in a way that is going to be highly relevant for you in your roles as telcos or communication service providers. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from Ngunnawal in Ngambri country, the land I grew up on. I'm visiting here, which is lovely to be back on these lands. And we just acknowledge that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I also want to give a bit of a content warning, and I'm assuming that most people are sort of coming to grips with the standard, and so they do understand the issue of domestic and family violence. But in this presentation, we will be touching on some examples of domestic and family violence, as well as other forms of abuse, particularly as they pertain to technology. And so this might be your first time hearing about some of these types of examples. We're assuming not, but just in case, we just want to let you know that if it's too much at any point, please feel free to take a break, and also reach out. We presume if you need support, you'll have either an EAP or reach out to help through to 1800-RESPECT or another organisation. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to be generally referring to victims as survivors, and will generally refer to them as women, and people who are abusers or who choose to use violence as male. And this is primarily because our particular work and our particular purpose is to assist women and their children who are experiencing domestic and family violence. However, we also acknowledge that gender-based violence is much broader than just family violence, and the abusers, while predominantly male, can be other genders, and even institutions, particularly if you are a person with disabilities, if you're a forcibly displaced person or a First Nations person, then sometimes systems and services and institutions can also be classified as abusers. So who are we at WesNet? So WesNet, the Women's Services Network, we're the national peak body or the national umbrella organisation for the specialist women's domestic and family violence services across Australia. And there's about 350 domestic and family violence services across Australia. And we assist those services by identifying gaps, unmet needs for all of our members and also the survivors that they work with. We also contribute to policy and sector debate, and we inform government policy around issues relating to ending gender-based violence. We're probably best known for the work that we do at the intersection of violence against women and technology, and we've been working in that space since 2011. And Catherine will come on in a second just to explain a little bit about our programs there. We also provide a lot of direct relief and training. We actually do provide technology to survivors of domestic and family violence with the assistance of the Australian government and very kind donations of handsets from Telstra. And we've recently just reached a significant milestone with having handed out our 50,000th phone with prepaid credit to a survivor. So terrible numbers of women who need phones and to need to stay connected, but we're very pleased to be able to provide that program. And we're also a founding member of the Global Network of Women's Shelters because, of course, this is a global problem and we work with many other organisations around the world to try and end domestic and family violence. I'd like to introduce you now to Catherine Plunkett. She is the director of our Safety Net Australia program, and she will talk a little bit about our particular program. Catherine.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here today. I'm quite new to WesNet. I've been in the director role for about a month, or just over a month, and I have a long history in working with practitioners, direct service providers, in specialist family violence services around practice models. I developed the Code of Practice for Victoria and also in related policy and advocacy work. So in terms of the Safety Net Australia program, it was actually co-founded by Karen, I think, as Janet said earlier, in 2011. And it was founded with our sister organisation NNEDV in the US. They are the equivalent of WesNet in the US, and they developed the US Safety Net project in 2001. So this is now an international project. So along with the US and us, there are safety net projects in Canada, the Netherlands, and Ireland. So there are 4 major elements to the Safety Net project. We provide training, as Karen said, including face-to-face, online webinars, and our National Technology Safety Summit, which is an annual summit. We provide advice to policymakers and technology companies, particularly around trust and safety issues in relation to people experiencing gender-based violence and safety and design. We provide support to frontline workers, that's specialist family violence practitioners who are working directly with clients who are experiencing domestic violence and tech abuse through our training, resources, and the provision of technical advice. And we also provide smartphones to survivors across Australia, those who need access to safe technology. We help them set up those phones safely, and we work with domestic violence services who are trained by us to help women set up those phones and use them safely and learn how to use safe technology. So we run this program in partnership with Telstra, and we just recently have distributed a total of 50,000 phones throughout Australia. I think we're back to Karen.
Thanks, Catherine. So I think we would like to just give you a bit of a run through some of the statistics. And I think these statistics are starting to be more well known around Australia now, because we've done a lot of surveys across Australia around people's experience of different forms of violence. So at the moment, the data is telling us that 1 in 6 women and 1 in 18 men have experienced physical or sexual violence by a current or previous partner who's living with them since the age of 15. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 14 men have experienced violence from an intimate partner at all since the age of 15. 1 in 6 women have experienced economic abuse by a current or previous cohabiting partner since the age of 15. And at the moment, about 1 woman is killed every 11 days and 1 man is killed every 91 days in Australia. We've had a bit of a reduction in the number of murders this year, but we're still sitting in the mid-20s by July this year. And we also know that particular groups are also experiencing violence at much higher rates. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander are one of the most at-risk groups for family and domestic violence in Australia, with 3 in 5 having experienced sexual or physical violence. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are 34 times more likely to be hospitalised due to family violence than other women in Australia, and 11 more times likely to die due to assault. We also know that groups like women with disabilities, LGBTQIA+, groups, refugees, migrants, and other marginalised groups are also experiencing violence and intersecting forms of that violence at much higher rates than other communities in Australia. I'm going to hand back to Catherine to talk about what domestic and family and sexual violence is and the many forms of it. Back to you, Catherine.
Thank you. So what we see here are some various forms of domestic and family and sexual violence. I guess the important thing here is to understand that this is a pattern of behaviour. It's systematic in the way that it's applied to a victim survivor. So it's not just one-off incidents. Here we have obviously physical and sexual violence. So in the context of domestic and family violence, that is repeated behaviour. And it is probably what we mostly have in mind when we're talking about family and domestic violence. But of course, much of family and domestic violence involves non-physical forms of violence. So they're often referred to as under a banner of coercive control, because all of these forms of abuse are designed to control and dominate another person. So emotional abuse, that is continuously running another person down, basically undermining their confidence, which will ultimately isolate them and disempower them. Economic and financial abuse, stalking, which can happen when people are together in a relationship as well as apart. So when they're together, that often involves tech abuse, the use of technology to stalk the other person, know where they are at every minute, control their movements. Social isolation and verbal abuse. So just the next slide on, Karen. It's a little bit more. Just some myths about domestic violence, because I guess we haven't got time to go into a lot of detail today, but it's very, very important that we understand, as well as generally what family violence is, what it's not. And this is because if we have misunderstandings about abuse, and they are common in the community, these misunderstandings, then we can end up victim blaming and ultimately are unable to provide assistance, because this completely shuts down victim survivors and they won't seek assistance from us. So the kinds of myths that are around are that why doesn't she leave? That if women only left, this wouldn't happen. This is a particularly dangerous myth, because the time of separation and the time leading up to and just following separation is by far the most dangerous time for women who've experienced family violence in the past. So it's very, in death reviews, in coroner's courts, it's a very common factor in homicide. She must have done something to cause the violence, so the idea of provocation, that it's some kind of conflict between the couple rather than there being one person systematically abusing another. She's putting her children at risk. That kind of guilt applied and shame applied to women will shut them down and put them off from seeking help. And it is also not putting accountability with the perpetrator of the violence. She's weak, she likes it, she's making it up. He's just jealous and possessive. These are behaviours that men who used violence, and it's usually men, will display. And they're really just about their need to control their partner and control her behaviour and her movements. And he has anger issues, he's mentally ill, or he was drinking. So things that can exacerbate violence, things like mental illness, things like alcohol abuse. They can make things much worse. They can create episodes of physical violence where there might have been coercive control and no physical violence, but they're not causal in family violence. So really important ones to understand there. And also to know that false claims of domestic violence or sexual assault are extremely rare, and there's a lot of research around this, that 80% of women who experience current partner violence don't contact the police about the violence. So most violence is unreported. And the same is true with sexual assault. 80% of women do not report sexual assault to police, and for good reason, because we have very low prosecution rates for sexual assault. Thanks, Karen.
Thanks, Catherine. So that's just a very quick flying overview, but we wanted to sort of talk to you about that, but also really understanding that there are a lot of myths in the community. So, and that's important for telcos because your workforce will also be representative of understanding some of those myths. So we wanted to then focus on why telcos need to think about domestic, family and sexual violence. And we did some research back in 2020 where we asked our frontline workers who were assisting all of their clients whether or not they had clients who were experiencing technology facilitated abuse. So we know that prevalence of domestic and family violence is huge in Australia, but when we asked the frontline workers how many of their clients were also experiencing some of that abuse through technology, 99.3% of frontline workers had clients who were experiencing tech abuse. And so the same survey also revealed that the top 3 technologies commonly used to abuse were text messages, smartphones, social media accounts, and there was also a big uptick in things like Wi-Fi network abuse, monitoring and surveillance of devices using covert methods like remote access tools, SIM swapping, spyware tools. And so it is actually now a very, very well accepted form, one form of, or one weapon that is used as part of domestic and family violence. And because we live in a digital age, if you are being abused through tech, then your capacity to stay connected and to stay on tech can be really impacted. So if you're being abused through your technology, then you may feel that you need to get off your technology, and that has really severe consequences on people's ability to actually stay safe, but also to participate both socially and economically. And we know that abusers are misusing technology in new ways every single day. So I wanted to quickly show you some of the ways which somebody can obtain information from a phone. So the first way that somebody might obtain information from a phone, which could be used to exert power and control or keep somebody under control, is by directly accessing your device. So if you're a victim of abuse, and you're living with your abuser, then you may have to hand over your device on a regular basis, or they can simply pick up your phone and they can see exactly what you're doing. So that might, really limit your freedom enabled in, the way that you live your life and who you can contact, what you can do and where you can go. Abusers also can do that through accessing the Telco account. So we know in many telcos and communication services around Australia, we've made it a lot easier for families and related parties to be able to have joint accounts or to be access on each other's accounts. But that can also be a double-edged sword because somebody can also access your telco account if they own it, for example. And you can get all sorts of information by accessing a telco account, who you rang, where you rang from, how long you spoke for. All of these things are pieces of information which may be quite devastating if you're trying to escape from or start a new life with away from an abuser. And then finally, apps and services. So in today's digital age, we've all got, well, I know I've got hundreds of apps and services that I now access through my mobile phone and through the internet. And so when people can access your apps and your services and your devices through online accounts, there's all sorts of information that you might be able to glean about an individual, which you might not necessarily want other people to access. So these are just some of the ways that, you know, a phone, for example, can be accessed or used. So you can imagine all of the different ways that that information on those phones can be used to limit somebody's life. So prevent them from leaving. They can monitor what they're doing. They can see who they're talking to. They can control all sorts of aspects of their life, which is really what Catherine was identifying earlier as some of those forms of coercive control. To give you a bit more examples now, I'm actually going to hand back over to Catherine, who's going to talk about some of the technology facilitated abuse red flags that we commonly see every day in domestic and family violence.
Okay, so these are commonly reported incidents that we are thinking that perhaps your customer service staff might hear at times, and in this case, they've been reported by victim survivors of family violence. So he ripped the modem out of the wall, a pretty obvious one, and not particularly techie, but incredibly effective, obviously, to cut her off. The idea being that being connected through technology is essential nowadays for our independent lives and for us as autonomous individuals. So it's obviously going to be an area of attack from an abuser. The Wi-Fi keeps dropping out and the settings keep changing. So sort of confusing things that are happening where she can't work out why. Or simply he broke into the home and he took a photo of the Wi-Fi password. So he's got the password, and once he's got the password, he obviously has access. Or social engineering, so him doing things through other people often, or through services to gain access. He found out my new account by accessing the account of my relative, or I'm being charged for a bundle that I didn't authorize, so he's gone directly through the telco, or I'm not receiving any 2FA codes. So where she's confused, but it's in the context of family violence, and she will normally be saying, I think it's my partner. Monitoring and surveillance, I have to get off the phone now or else my partner will hear me, so she's not free to speak. Sometimes there's so much static on the line, I can barely hear anything. And my calls disconnect whenever I talk to my new partner, so her calls are being monitored. So they're just a few of the examples that your customer service facing staff may hear at times. And I guess from this, we want to look at what can we do when we're asked for help. So in the case of telcos and all of us, just to remember that helping individuals and families become safe is a community-wide responsibility. It's not just the responsibility of police, courts, specialist family violence services. It's very well established and understood now in the research that we need community-wide responses, and there needs to be, in order for women and children to be safe, then the responses need to be consistent throughout the community. So we each have a role to play, and that's where telcos come in, particularly because technology is used as a weapon in family violence so often. So when responding to people affected by domestic violence, we use what's called a trauma-informed approach. And in the standards for telcos, this is an expectation that your customer-facing service staff will be using a trauma-informed approach. And to do this, we have to understand, first of all, the dynamics of domestic violence and its impact on family members. So a little bit of what we covered before, but in more depth. The ways that trauma may manifest in a person's behaviour, and understanding that these behaviours are their best attempts to manage and overcome the challenges they face. So sometimes women who've experienced a lot of violence are very angry. Sometimes they're distressed and crying. Other times they're furious at everyone because they haven't been able to get the protection they're seeking. So there can be different kinds of behaviours that are manifested when someone's experiencing trauma. And the other thing is, of course, the diverse backgrounds and experiences of individuals will influence their needs and their responses. So to always be listening and keeping an open mind. And finally, we need to understand how to respond in a way that does no harm. And that's what we mean by a trauma-informed response, that we're avoiding re-traumatization and we're creating a safe space to problem solve. So that's very quickly an overview of what's meant by trauma-informed. And finally, from me, intervention should never mirror abuse, and they can sometimes if they're not trauma informed. So, you know, really important for everyone to have received basic training in how to respond, but also to remember that when we're talking about technology facilitated abuse, that perpetrators are trying to remove her access, to technology and therefore to independence as an individual. So we need to assist her to retain access to technology. And you know, that's fundamentally what it's about, but we need to help victim survivors retain access to technology safely. And that there are times when agencies can unintentionally collude with abusers, and abusers can be very clever in the way that they speak to various agencies, and it's not you know, not just commercial services either, but police, courts, and so we need to be very cautious about abusers running arguments about why they should have control over their partner's account or anything like that. Thanks, Karen.
So thanks very much for the opportunity to come and speak to you about it. We do a lot of work in this area of that intersection between tech and violence against women. And we have a whole website that's sort of dedicated to it. I think at the end of the day, we are really pleased to see this standard in place. We're really very keen to assist telcos with your implementation of it so that survivors can remain on their tech, because it's absolutely vital. You know, a phone is an absolute lifeline to somebody who's experiencing domestic and family violence. So thanks very much. If you'd like to contact us, we've put this on the slide, and I believe this is being recorded, so you'll be able to come back and contact us if you need to. And I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Karen and Catherine. Very much appreciated. Can everybody hear me? I'm just double checking. I think so. Yes, I'm good. Thank you. The thumbs up are great. And thank you for the insights. You know, just something as simple as somebody as breaking into a house and taking a photo of your Wi-Fi password had never even occurred to me, but that's really awful, and obviously something that telcos and customer service staff would be facing, a request for a new password, whatever. So thank you for those insights. Our next speaker is Samantha York. Samantha is an authority member at ACMA, and she's a values-driven lawyer by training. Samantha has spent over 20 years working for blue chip multinational consumer digital and media and technology businesses in Europe and the Asia Pacific region as well. She moved into public service in 2023 as an authority member for ACMA and leads consumer regulatory enforcement. I'm really looking forward to hearing from Samantha on the standard and her views. I'll pass over to you, Samantha.
Thank you so much, Janet, for that lovely introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. I am joining this webinar from Camaragal land in the Eora Nation here in Sydney, and it is so wonderful to be here with you all today. I want to thank Telco Together for the chance to give you some insight into the development of the Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence Standard that the ACMA recently developed. and what we can achieve through this standard to support these vulnerable consumers. I'd also like to really thank Catherine and Karen for such a sobering assessment of the scale and severity of this issue, and just for the incredible work that your organisations are doing in this space. So thank you too. So as many of you will know, the ACMA have now formally made the Telecommunications Domestic Family and Sexual Violence Consumer Protection Industry Standard 2025 earlier this month. And yes, that is the full title of this standard. Some of the rules are commencing tomorrow, so this webinar is very timely, and some of the rules and obligations will come into effect in 6 months. But we thought, just before jumping into the substance of the standard, I might just revisit why this standard was developed in the first place and highlight some of the key considerations that went into the design of this new standard. Understanding how these rules came to be and what we intended them to accomplish will hopefully assist all of you in better understanding and implementing the obligations that sit within the standard. So it's already been mentioned by Catherine and Karen that access to safe, reliable communications is really essential for all of us, but particularly those who are experiencing or escaping domestic and family violence. So in some cases, I don't think it's at all dramatic to say that this could mean the difference between life and death. Providing victim survivors and their children with access to emergency services in the case of a direct threat is just one very critical example of why ongoing connectivity is so important. It can also be vital for access to resources and essential support services to enable victim survivors to escape and re-establish their lives, particularly with many services now including some form of identity verification that often uses a code, as we would all know, sent to our mobile number or our email address. And at the same time, as we've just heard from Catherine and Karen, technology-facilitated abuse is also becoming increasingly common, with telecommunications being used to facilitate domestic and family violence through a variety of means that we've just heard some very concrete examples of. So why did we consider a standard needed to be developed in this area? So I want to first acknowledge and appreciate the work done by the Telco Together Foundation, as Janet showed us on the timeline at the beginning of this webinar, to develop the action framework way back in 2020. And I also want to acknowledge and appreciate the work done by Communications Alliance / the Australian Telecommunications Alliance in reviewing and updating their domestic and family violence guidance 2 years ago, back in May 2023. But this guidance was not mandatory or enforceable. And also, while we know that many of you have existing support processes in place, the telco sector has become very large. And while some telcos were offering protections, others were offering little or in some cases no targeted support for this community of customer. And at the same time, we were also beginning to very consistently hear from consumer advocacy groups, customer complaints, and also from findings from our own investigations that certain telcos were falling short, and sometimes well short, of the levels of service and support that the community broadly and people experiencing domestic and family violence should expect from their telcos. So just to give you some examples of types of behaviour that we have directly observed, and I would emphasise that these are not isolated one-off instances, because the circumstances that you'll hear about are very similar to those that have been occurring on multiple occasions across multiple telcos. So we really reject that, that these were very isolated incidences caused just by one example of a poor customer support officer. So, for instance, A customer with children asked her telco to urgently reconnect her service as she was returning home to an abusive partner and was extremely concerned that she would need to be able to call 000. The telco provider advised that customer that they would need to go into a retail store with the alleged perpetrator to get their service reconnected. Another customer had been in a long-term domestic and family violence situation where the perpetrator had taken out multiple telco accounts in her name, from which she received no benefit. She had contacted her provider multiple times to ask for assistance and was repeatedly required to disclose her experience suffering at the hands of a perpetrator of domestic and family violence. She was seeking assistance to reverse these contracts, waive the debts that had been incurred under those contracts, and close the accounts on the grounds of domestic and family violence and financial hardship. And it wasn't until the customer said that she would contact the telecommunications industry ombudsman that the provider waived 1 month of payment, but the customer was later disconnected. And the last example I'll share with you is a customer that was in a financial hardship situation after leaving an abusive relationship, which was exacerbated by having to pay for multiple devices placed in his name. The customer attempted to lower his payments and to consolidate those multiple accounts into one, but was forced onto a direct debit payment plan without notice. The customer was disconnected on multiple occasions after falling into debt and incurring multiple defaults. In one instance, a transfer was actioned incorrectly, which gave the perpetrator access to his accounts, which was a breach of his privacy and put his safety at further risk. The provider stated that he was required to conduct a conference call with the perpetrator to facilitate that transfer. So it's been clear to us for some time that there's been a problem in the industry as it relates to supporting customers that are victim survivors of domestic and family violence. And it was clear to us that the existing safeguards, such as the protections for vulnerable consumers in the Telecommunications Consumer Protection Code, were just not doing enough to make sure that consumers were receiving the support that they needed. Despite efforts to address this through other initiatives, including our position paper titled Consumer Vulnerability, Expectations for the Telecommunications Industry, which was released back in May 2022, which set out outcomes and expectations and provided some specific examples for better supporting domestic and family violence customers, these problems were persisting. So the ACMA considered a range of options for pursuing safeguards for telco consumers. Ultimately, it was determined that an industry standard was the best option for offering clear, robust, and enforceable protections to telco customers seeking support under domestic and family violence policies. This recognised a number of factors, including the potential risks and harms to consumers from poor or inadequate protections, and whether the nature of the penalties that were in existence was commensurate with the potential harms that could be experienced. In particular, we thought about things like the level of harm associated with domestic and family violence generally, and the critical role that telecommunications services play in helping keep victim survivors and their children safe. We thought about the need to mitigate any risk of increased harm through preventable actions on the part of carriage service providers. We thought about our existing two-step enforcement process and the available financial penalties that we could impose for breaches of a direction to comply with an industry code, and thought that they were not well suited to being able to proportionally target any enforcement action with these potentially high risks and devastating harms to consumers. And one of the final things that we thought about was that proposed DFV protections in the version of the draft TCP code that we were seeing midway through last year we just still didn't think were adequate. They lacked a bit of sufficient detail and clarity and would have been difficult for us as the regulator to enforce, despite having provided clear and ongoing feedback on expectations. So some key considerations for us as we thought about how to design this standard were, first of all, fulfilling the obligations and the objectives that were set out in the direction from our minister to develop this standard, which is a requirement under the Telecommunications Act that we work within. We also thought about how we could design this standard to prioritise safety. We thought about how we could design the standard to reduce existing harms being experienced by consumers experiencing domestic and family violence. And it was also really important to us that we struck the appropriate balance so that both carriage service providers and consumers know what is expected while still retaining an appropriate level of flexibility. Dealing with domestic and family violence is a complex and nuanced matter. Everybody's experience is individual, and protections and approaches that assist one customer might harm another. So that it's very important that there is flexibility and discretion built into the way in which telcos can implement this standard. It was front of mind for us in designing the standard as well that we needed to listen to those who would be directly impacted by these protections. So we consulted extensively with both domestic and family violence and broader consumer advocates, including those with lived experience, as well as industry representatives who had practical experience of implementing some of the existing regulatory frameworks. Hearing from those who needed support and those who would be tasked with delivering it helped us in striking a balance in a number of areas. Obviously, in designing the standard, the first consideration for us was ensuring that it did address the matters set out in our minister's direction. These can be summarised as prioritising safety, taking a tailored approach to ensure privacy and security, training and supporting staff in identifying and supporting customers, putting in place and complying with trauma-informed policies, systems and processes, and Catherine mentioned those in her presentation, offering domestic and family violence affected consumers appropriate assistance, and consulting with relevant experts. In dealing with the other key considerations, we needed to identify the gaps. What were the current rules? What protections did consumers need? What was happening in practice? And where were the shortfalls? And a lot of this work has been done over the past 3 years through the statement of expectations that I mentioned earlier, some consumer research that the ACMA carries out called What Consumers Want. That was released back in July 2023. And our ongoing engagement with consumer advocates and the telecommunications industry ombudsman. We also conducted some specific targeted audits and investigations into existing domestic and family violence support practices, which really helped us to highlight specific areas of concern where domestic and family violence affected consumers were experiencing harms caused by those existing policies. So as highlighted in some of the examples I mentioned earlier, we did see a concerning trend in practices such as requiring victim survivors to engage directly with their abusers before action could be taken, failing to remove service restrictions or to reconnect customers, including those who had been disconnected for non-payment and financial hardship reasons, despite being made aware that the customer's safety was at risk due to an abusive partner or ex-partner. Disclosures of personal information, including location, to former abusive partners. And the last concerning practice that we had been made aware of was requiring the domestic and family violence affected person to disclose their circumstances on multiple occasions to different customer service agents. So our consultations also helped us refine and better understand both the issues facing consumers and the harms they were causing, and how some of you were already dealing with them or the unintended consequences that some of the proposed protections in the draft standard could cause if implemented. So look, I'll wrap this session up, allowing time for Pepe and Annie's panel discussion by just sharing how these design considerations are put into practice by the obligations in the standard. So in terms of prioritising safety, where a carriage service provider deals directly with the affected person, the standard stipulates that it must take actions such as advising the person of available support, discussing the support options with them, reversing a service limiting action as a matter of urgency, for example, reconnection. The carriage service provider should not require the person to repeat their story. It should not require the person to deal directly with the alleged perpetrator. And the telco and the customer should agree on a preferred communication channel that is safe for the consumer to use. In terms of reducing existing harms, as mentioned, to not require the person to repeat their story and not require the person to deal directly with their alleged perpetrator. We've also tried to design the standard to consider the impact of debt before taking credit action. So this draws on feedback from consumer advocates that this is also a serious harm for victims of economic abuse in particular. And as I mentioned, we were also very committed to striking the right balance. So we have included an obligation on telcos to collect evidence in very difficult cases where it is not immediately apparent to the telco whether in fact the person that they are talking to is indeed the victim survivor and whether they can act on those instructions. This should be very rare. As mentioned by Catherine and Karen, instances of people lying about their circumstances as it relates to domestic and family violence are very rare. We also introduced delayed and staged implementation timeframes in the standard. This was acknowledging that some of the new obligations would require engineering workarounds by telcos or whole new ways of developing support, training, and the delivery of that training to customers. So as I mentioned, some of the obligations come into effect tomorrow, others in 6 months' time. So what happens next is that the ACMA now turns our mind to developing guidance for industry on the obligations in the standard and our expectations about how industry can support a flexible consumer-led approach. This guidance will focus on how we intend the provisions to work and our expectations around the exercise of discretion, noting that each case will be different and might require a different response. Overall, the guidance will be designed to assist industry in delivering the intended protections to affected people. And if you haven't already, I'd encourage you to sign up to our telco updates because we'll be providing regular updates through this channel. If you just do a search for ACMA subscribe to our online updates, you'll then be up to date on developments of this industry guidance on the standard. So thank you. I will leave it there. I hope that's been helpful. And Janet, I will hand back to you.
Thanks, Samantha. That's a very thorough explanation of how you arrived at the standard and what sort of thinking has gone into it. So very much appreciated. I'm sure there are people on the call who that's given a lot more context to them. And I think context in these situations is a really important thing. So thank you so much for that. It's much appreciated. So we're going to jump into a quick panel with a couple of people, two individuals who are deeply familiar with the issue of DFV from a telco perspective and have been integral in providing industry feedback through the development of the standard, and that is Annie from TPG Telecom and Pepe from the Communications Alliance, which I note has just been renamed. So Annie is a telco regulatory specialist, consumer advocate and lawyer. She brings a wealth of experience with her, so I'm really interested to hear her view. And Pepe is a seasoned policy and regulatory strategist who's been with Comms Alliance since early 2022. She's led policy development and advocacy efforts and ensured that industry voices have been well represented in these sorts of discussions. So we're going to, we've got both of you online. Yes, Annie and Peppy. So welcome. Thank you both for coming along today. I've got a few questions I'm just going to throw around as a panel, and we'll see where our discussions take us. But a question to start with for each of you, maybe starting with Annie first. Why do you think this standard is important?
Yeah, Janet, I think that from a telco, so I'm speaking purely from, I guess, from a TPG telecom perspective, which I am a regulatory specialist here. But the other part of my role, and as a co-regulatory environment, my other role is as the chair of the Comms Alliance, or now the ATA Domestic Family Violence Working Group. So it's that working group that developed the Domestic Family Violence Guideline that Comms Alliance have had published for several years now. So while we had an update in 2023, the first work of developing that guideline was in 2016. So well before some of the regulatory obligations came, and even before it was a real conversation being had at that regulatory level, Comms Alliance recognised the importance of our industry when it comes to providing support and assistance for those affected by domestic and family violence. So whilst there was absolutely an opportunity to strengthen some of those rules, and we were strongly in agreement around the need to regulate and formalise those rules, I think our industry, at least through the Comms Alliance working group, has recognised the importance of consistent, clear support for those affected to ensure that they can come and get the assistance they need to remain connected to friends, family and support in their moments of need.
Thanks, Annie. What about you, Peppy? Why do you think the standard is important?
I think Annie's captured it pretty well. I would add that the Domestic and Family Violence Guideline that Comms Alliance published, originally first version 2018 and the updated one in 2023, we have withdrawn but still making available on our website in recognition of the new standard, because clearly lots of the you should do this, you should do that are now musts under the standard, but we've chosen to make it still available because it's a very useful document for CSPs to get their head around the issues in a lot more detail than we've just discussed today, to clearly show, explain how the issue can present to telcos. It acknowledges their responsibility, the challenges, the issues. This is not a straightforward issue. It is very complex. Telco can be used as a mechanism for support as well as one for abuse. And the presentation of domestic and family violence through your telco service, it can be very varied. And the response, as already mentioned, needs to be consumer-led. For the safety of the victim, survivor, but also you need to bear in mind the safety of the people dealing with it from the CSP's end. So we go into lots of detail in the guideline about that, and the guideline also goes into a lot of detail about how obligations and considerations need to be considered in the context of other laws, codes, etc. So I would encourage, I can share the link to the superseded guideline in the chat, but I would say if people are coming from, CSPs are coming from a very low understanding of the issues, having a skim through, and it is quite long, but having a skim through this will help you get across the terminology, the issues, the interactions with other instruments, and as a good basis for starting to think about the policies, training, etc., that are required. And I should mention that we developed the original guideline and the updates with lots of input from everybody from government agencies through to Wesnet, who were fantastic to deal with, other consumer advocacy bodies. So it came from a very informed, iterative approach to drafting and was very well received. It's not compulsory, and the standard makes a lot of those things compulsory, but I still would suggest that it's a very useful resource for people to use.
Thanks, Peppy.
Sorry, I wanted just to agree with Peppy on that last piece about the compulsory. There are elements in the guideline that you'll see where there's the strongly recommended, which are the ones that we were really firmly believed everybody should be doing. And so from a rules perspective, it's really wonderful to get to see that come to life and actually have that mandated. It's just now a matter of actually operationalising it in a way that's safe for you and safe for your staff. And the guideline will give just some insights, whilst it's not, again, it can't be relied upon for compliance. It will help give some insights as to what it will look like for a telco. I think that there can be confusion between tech and telco. And whilst we're all in the digital space, we are doing very different things. So it's just important to make sure that you're looking at it from a telco perspective.
Absolutely, thank you. Peppy, I couldn't agree more. I remember diving into that standard when I used to work in the industry, and it was comprehensive. Well, not standard, sorry, the guideline, sorry. And it was a very handy document to refer to in all sorts of instances. So I would echo your comments. Peppy, can you talk a little bit about how Comms Alliance contributed to the standard, and whether you think there were any areas of the standard that required more industry consultation than others?
I mean, we talk to ACMA all the time and provide feedback. Our comments on the standard, some of them are public. Others, it was discussion points about trying to get the balance right to ensure that everybody is safe in managing this. I think I'll probably leave it there. It's ACMA are very keen to get this right. They do understand it's complicated, and further comments on that I will leave to them to answer.
Okay, thank you. Annie, your perspective is really critical too, because you're not only involved in the development of the standard, but you're one of the people implementing it on the ground. What do you think are some of the bigger challenges in implementing changes like this within a telco?
Yeah. And if I just start, so to be clear, obviously we provided feedback to the standard itself, and I'm really grateful for the ACMA's approach to this one. I think it was a really wonderful comprehensive consultation, which I think acknowledged the really complicated issues that we're dealing with. Some consultation processes are better than others. This is definitely on the better end of the scale, so I just wanted to acknowledge that. It was definitely the call outs around where we felt that we would be limited for providing safe and effective support. I felt were really well heard. So I just wanted to say a quick thank you on that one. When it comes to implementation, it will always be a matter of the process starts with identification. So actually having processes in place that enable your staff to be able to identify that someone's affected by domestic and family violence will be the trigger point. And if you're not doing that part well, you can't do any of the other safety requirements that follow. That is a complicated thing to do. There are a maze of different ways that a consumer might present as affected by domestic and family violence. There will be more subtle presentations with more subtle language. There will be more overt presentations with more overt language. You'll also have staff that have their own journey and have their own complicated human history and might struggle to interact with some of these things. So it's never just a matter of, well, you should have seen that, because we're dealing with really complex human things with human beings doing a lot of the work. So the main part will be the support process and training that staff receive in order to enable them to do that identification work and provide the support. So purely from a telco perspective, I think that's it for me, is how do you spot that something's happening that needs that additional support, because everything flows from there. But that is a very easy thing to say, an incredibly complicated thing to do.
Yeah, especially kind of the larger you get as a telco, the more complicated it gets, right?
Yeah, there's also the safety elements, psychological safety, physical safety of our staff, as well as of the affected person. So it's always easier said than done, and on these safety issues can be very complicated.
Yep.
Sorry, we have tried to give examples in the guideline of some of the red flags that might suggest that there's a problem that telcos should look at, but there are excellent organisations that also work with us all the time, as you know, it's just presented, that really have the expertise to build that out and be there for further advice. But it is different depending on the size of your telco and what products you're offering and how the services can be used, and it's not one size fits all, as has already been mentioned.
No, absolutely.
For example, a fixed line service provider. So if you just sell the fixed internet, it's a very different presentation to mobile. and the complications that may arise. So it's just the nature of it all will be a little bit different. Within the guideline as well, as much as it's superseded, we do have a list of organisations that provide training and support. So that is something that if you're not currently engaging with someone to assist with the review parts of the standard, there is a list of organisations there that we've had connections with through Comms Alliance that we've provided some recommendations for.
And
Lovely.
probably the other bit, sorry, mentioning on the appendices for the guidelines that's still definitely relevant and useful. On the issue's been mentioned a few times about control of the account. Or obviously, a telco account is a little different from, say, from some other accounts where you can have it's owned by one person who may be the perpetrator and somebody else has got a number that's connected to it but doesn't have control of it. So the guideline explains some of those issues, and practical steps for separating rights of use of numbers is one of the appendices. So again, still very relevant in thinking through the issues and how you deal with them.
Yeah, thank you. Because that's really, the next challenge, noting we've only got 5 minutes left in this meeting. But really the challenge ahead for telcos implementing this is, what does it practically look like on the ground? And how do we wrap around our staff to enable them to be the front line in this, which is really critical. And Annie, I like your reference to the fact that some staff may not be able to participate in this sort of work because it's not in their capacity. They've been, or they might be triggered by personal experiences. And I know that the Telco Together framework deals not only with customers, well, how we deal with customers, but also with staff who've experiencing domestic and family violence. And certainly I've been in a telco where we've had to deal with that sort of thing as well. So whilst this standard is all about how we deal with our customers, staff are the kind of critical part of it, aren't they?
Yeah.
They're the ones who are helping us deliver this to our customers. So really
absolutely
important.
they're not automatons. We don't just feed the requirements into them and they spit them out perfectly every time.
No. I would make a personal observation, if I may, that sometimes when telcos are wrestling with how to embed this culturally, sometimes I find it useful to refer back to your values as an organisation and whether any of those align with this sort of work. If they do, then for instance, Aussie Broadband had a great value, still has a great value, which is be good to people. And this sort of work really aligned with that. And other organisations who are wrestling with this at the moment might find that a useful way to look at it. Any other hot tips from either of you on implementation before we wrap up?
I think the only other comment from me, and Peppy referenced it before, is there are a lot of other obligations that conflict and work in either sometimes in coordination and sometimes in conflict with it. So for those of you that have a legal or a regulatory or compliance team, really encourage you to make sure you're checking in with them to make sure that things like our scam prevention activity, our customer ID determination requirements, our financial hardship assistance requirements are all being met through this process. Some of them will provide support and some of them will provide, we'll just make it a little bit more complicated, and you just need to make sure that you're checking that off, particularly thinking around the scam prevention framework. There is some assistance on how potentially to approach some of that in the guideline. Again, caveat, not the rules. But we have tried to provide that guidance in the past, particularly as Peppy mentioned around rights of use for mobile services, which is a fairly complicated one and has been the driver of both scam work and domestic and family violence assistant work. So just want to call that one out as we're a complicated environment. There's not just one set of rules we need to think about here.
Thank you. Sorry for the noise behind me. For anybody who didn't join us earlier, that's my snoring dog in the background.
It's a good mute. The only other thing I want just to mention was some of the feedback we got in the guidance from organisations dealing with this every day was be aware you're not going to get it right every single time, and the pressure on staff and their emotional well-being and thinking that they're going to get somebody killed, which is a possible outcome, unfortunately. Obviously, you do everything you can, but be awake to that. That this is a really complicated issue.
Yeah, I think on that as well, as we do need to remember that we're telcos, and that we're here to assist them with their telecommunication service. So again, back to the psychological support for your staff, make sure you've got really good referral processes to assist them in, okay, I've done what I can for your telco. You now need to go and speak to a domestic and family violence service professional or a professional service to have a conversation about everything else that's going on with you. Don't expect your staff to take that on. Expect them to help kind of with that first initial piece, whether it's a financial hardship, whether it's connection, but it's not their role, or there should never be an expectation placed on them that they do more than that.
Very good tips. Thank you very much. Ladies, that was a really useful discussion, and I hope everyone got something from that. We're about to wrap up. There are a couple of questions that came in through the chat. One is quite a complex one from Peter that we probably should direct straight to the ACMA team. So we'll do that, Peter, take it offline for you. And the other one was people asking for a list of the training providers, and Peppy has kindly put up a link to the guideline from Comms Alliance. So your training providers are listed in that. I think they are also listed in the Telco Together training framework, and you can register to get free access, I think, to that via the Telco Together Foundation website. So my dogs are just starting to go off, so that kind of tells me that we should be about finished. Thank you everyone for joining us, and it's very much appreciated that you took, an hour and 15 out of your time today to learn more about the standard, and we hope that this has been of some use to you. So thank you very much. Best of luck with your implementation, and critically, I hope that we can help people in Australia to better overcome domestic and family violence. Thank you.